Hello folks, this is Mr. O'Brien and welcome to Lesson 22. So the aim question is, what were the significant issues facing freed people after the Civil War / during Reconstruction? In a subsequent lesson we will go over exactly what's meant by Reconstruction, but for now it's enough to know that it stands for the decade and a half or so after the Civil War in which the Union attempted to reincorporate the Southern secessionist states back into the Union, and they attempted to reconstruct the Constitution with the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, and they attempted to help 4 million freed people adapt to their newfound freedom. And when there's a D in there, freed people, it means people freed by the Civil War. And for the do now, you are going to participate in a Reconstruction Mixer, which will be a little bit different because you are not able to attend in real life. So let's get to it. The Reconstruction Mixer. All right, so what's going to happen is I'm going to read this to you. I mean, if it was in class, if you were in class, we'd be popcorning it, and I wouldn't be reading it at all, actually. But I'll read the kind of introduction here. I'll read the directions. I'll point out the different interview questions you'll have for each other, and the different descriptions of the different historical figures who were all real human beings. And I will point out on Google Forms or Google Classroom exactly what you will be doing. All right, so let's get to it. Again, this is called When the Impossible Suddenly Became Possible, a Reconstruction Mixer. All right, so shortly after hearing in 1865 that she and others on her Florida plantation were no longer enslaved, Frances told a friend what she thought their future might look like. This is real. Quote, "This time next year, all the white folks will be at work in the fields and the plantations and the houses, and everything in them will be turned over to us to do with as we please." Close quote. While her fantasy didn't become a reality, well, it was looking close to that for a little bit, but it didn't become a reality, something remarkable did. Without saying anything to their former owner on New Year's Day, 1866, every freed slave on the plantation left. So the ability of newly freed people to imagine their former owners serving them, or to walk off a plantation en masse in a society that had heavily policed black movement, reveals the possibilities of a period where something that had only a few years prior seemed unthinkable now was a fact of life. In other words, the end of slavery inspired people to demand freedoms or demand things, opportunities that they never thought were possible a year or two earlier. All right, or they never would have thought to make those demands earlier. Because as historian David Roediger writes in his book Seizing Freedom, if anything seemed impossible in the 1850s political universe, it was the immediate, unplanned, and uncompensated emancipation of 4 million slaves, close quote. When this once seemingly impossible fate became a reality, it democratized and revolutionized U.S. society. The sense that the impossible could be made possible by the organization of oppressed people to fight against their oppression had implications far beyond the struggle against slavery. As Roediger documents, between 1865 and 1869, a series of, quote, war and emancipation-inspired insurgencies raised the possibilities for something like a 19th century rainbow coalition of different races and ethnicities, seeking to bring together the nation's aggrieved. But ultimately, racism and sexism tore these movements apart, and the consequences left black people few allies to fight the insurgent white supremacists that one by one overthrew Reconstruction governments in the South. And we'll watch a movie later in the unit that shows that happening. Hollywood made a movie about the southern states being redeemed. Continuing, this mixer aims to draw out many of these lessons for you by introducing you to individuals in the various social movements that followed the Civil War and their attempts to build alliances with one another. In the mixer, you will take on the role of a different person involved in the social movements of the time. Several roles focus on the close alliance and tragic split between the feminist and abolitionist movement. Other roles emphasize the important efforts to break down racism and sexism inside the emerging labor movement. A few roles touch on alliances that abolitionists built with the movements against Indian removal and for Cuban independence from Spain. Lastly, several roles focus on the incredible transformation of Black life in the South, the key example of the impossible becoming possible. As you meet, if you were able to attend, as you meet other individuals in the room or by looking through their different backgrounds, you learn the revolutionary possibility of solidarity, of working together, the potential power of social movements working together. But these stories also reveal how racism, sexism, and classism can keep movements divided. For those of you today who care about movements for social justice and whether those movements might coalesce to form something even more powerful, this lesson opens a window into the possibilities and pitfalls, the promises and perils such a project might face. Procedure. Whoa. Procedure. As mentioned above, you are going to do an activity about the social movements that emerged after the Civil War. Many people were inspired by the abolition of slavery to demand things that they had previously considered impossible. This meant that after the Civil War, many new social movements emerged, and there were some attempts to bring them together. But by 1870, those fighting for justice in different movements remained divided. In this activity, you are going to meet many of the people involved in these movements to try to understand what brought them together after the Civil War and what ultimately kept many of them apart. All right, so this doesn't matter for you. I mean, there are 21 roles, so many different figures to choose among. All right, but you are to choose one person to be. All right, you are to read about yourself and get to know yourself. If you look down here, beginning on page 3, you'll begin to see the different figures. All right, male, female, different races, different ethnicities. I'm going to ask you when you do begin to answer these interview questions, making pretend to meet the people in this packet, that you try and choose a diverse group of individuals. All right, but let's get to the Google form. All right, so if you look at the Reconstruction Mixer, that's on Google Forms. I mean, when you're looking at this, the video will be above this, the one that I'm making right now. But again, if you look at the instructions here, since you were unable to attend the Reconstruction Mixer, below you are to choose a figure from the packet to answer each of the interview questions, quote, parentheses, to recreate mingling. All right, so below you will see 8 different questions, and they correspond to the exact 8 questions that you see here in the packet. Right, so what you're going to do is, if you were in the room having the actual mixer, you would get 8 different individuals to answer these 8 questions for you, kind of forcing you to mingle. All right, number 1, find someone who was enslaved before the war and accomplished something afterward that they never thought they could have under slavery. What did they accomplish? Number 2, find someone who worked for both black rights and women's rights. Who is this person and what did they do to help both causes? Number 3, find someone who contributed to or has an opinion about the split between those fighting for black rights and those fighting for women's rights. What did they do that contributed to this split? Or what is their opinion about this split? There should be a space there. Find someone who tried to build an alliance between black and white workers or farmers. What did the person do? What can they tell you about how poor white and black people did or did not work together during Reconstruction? Find someone who tried to build an alliance between those fighting for women's rights and those fighting for workers' rights. What did this person do? What can this person tell you about why the alliance did not last? Number 6, find someone who connected the struggle for black rights to a fight other than the women's or workers' movements. For example, the fight against war, the struggles of Indians for their land, or Cubans for independence. Who is this person? What did they do? Find someone who can tell you about efforts to form a new third party or the role the Republican Party played in uniting or dividing various social movements. Who is this person, and what is their opinion about political parties? Do you agree? And again, you have to choose one person to be and get to know yourself. And when I say do you agree, I mean in that person's shoes. Whoever you choose to be, in that person's shoes, do you agree? In your role, find someone you could take common action with. Again, knowing your role. Come up with one idea for the action you might take together to further the causes you are passionate about. Who is the person and what action might you take together? So if you look back at the Google form, all right, once you get those 8 questions answered, you then will click on just submit, next, whatever it is, and you will go to section 2, and it is the post-mixer discussion questions. All right. So out of all the people you met, whose story did you find most interesting? Meaning you individually, like really you. Why? From your point of view, whose was the most interesting? Even if you think it's the person you chose to be. Was it possible for different social movements to work together after the Civil War? What brought them closer? What pushed them apart? In general. And the last question, by 1870, those fighting for justice in different movements remained divided, and it would be decades before these movements again converged. What do you think were some of the consequences of this division? All right, so that is the Reconstruction Mixer.